Okay, to get our class started, I would like to introduce our volunteer speakers today. And Mr. Graham Friendly is the Managing Director within Grant Thornton's Global Public Sector Practice. And he'll be talking about himself a little bit more and give you some of his background, and then he'll introduce his second speaker. Thank you.
Okay. Morning, everyone. Morning. Is the sound okay? Can everybody hear me at the back? Raise hands if you can hear me. Okay, I'll try and speak up a little. Again, good morning. My name is Graham Finley, Managing Director with Grant Thornton. Sort of my role within Grant Thornton, I run our local California consulting practice, working a lot with the state. Got about, 20-something years experience working with mostly public sector organizations, though I've done some work in the commercial sector as well, federal, various states, some stuff in Europe. And Carlos asked me to be part of the presentation team here today, partially because I've seen a lot of different California projects in various capacities, being involved in one way or another, and so we've had some sort of hands-on experience seeing what's gone well and what's not gone well on a number of projects. And of course, I'm a vendor. I'm not a state employee. So when we're talking about projects and the risks and issues around projects, I have a little bit of a different perspective, and that might be interesting to talk about later on. So that's a bit about my background. Our other presenter is Jamie Mangrum. So Jamie, just want to introduce yourself a little?
I'm the Chief Information Officer for the Department of State Hospitals. I've been in state service for about 18 years. I was the CIO at the Department of General Services, the CIO for the Federal Receivership under Clark Kelso, and also the Agency Information Officer for CDCR. I also was asked, primarily because I'm project-centric CIO, I don't normally work at organizations where I run operations. I normally go to organizations to roll out large projects, and that's pretty much what I've done most of my career. Had some of the larger, if not largest, project management organizations in the state at the receivership and other places working for me. So I've seen a lot of enterprise projects deployed and understand pretty well what to do and what to do them successfully.
Okay. Thanks. So our agenda this morning, we're going to do a little bit of introductions, just talking about why we're here, why do we care about risks and issues, why are they important, what's the purpose of risk and issue management. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the basics, sort of risk and issue management 101. Depending on the background in the room, we may try and move through that pretty quickly. It's relatively dry. It's also not especially complicated, but we do want to cover that material. And then we'll spend some time talking about common project risks and issues, particularly common risks and issues that have been seen repeatedly on the state of California projects. We want to talk about what some of those are and what kind of things to watch out for and potential ways to mitigate some of those risks and issues. And then we'll talk about the characteristics of an effective risk and issue management organization. I think one of the messages or one of the concepts we'll talk about this morning is you can never really prepare for everything. You're always going to be surprised. And so a big part of how effective you are as a project is dealing with surprises, and that comes down to how well your organization deals with uncertainty and how well it can adapt. And so we'll spend a bit of time talking about that. And then we have a case study exercise where we're going to be taking a real project and reviewing some information about that project, and then in teams, and we'll describe later how to separate into groups, you will take a look at that and try and identify some of the significant risks and issues related to that project and try and identify potential mitigation strategies associated with that. And then we'll have some discussion as a group. Does anybody have any questions about the agenda? Okay, so what we're hoping you'll get out of this morning, the objectives for the class, first is to understand the purpose and the importance of risk and issue management. Why is it something we should be paying attention to? The second is gain some familiarity with the basic processes and tools for managing risks and issues on projects. So at least you can walk away with some of those basic tool sets if it's not something you've done before. And then the last piece, and probably the most important piece, is discuss some real-world examples of common risks and issues and take away some ideas about how to deal with them. All right. Anything you want to add before we get started? All right. So let's just start talking about what is project risk and issue management. So at its most basic, it's an acknowledgement that you do not know everything. It's an acknowledgement of uncertainty. There are things that are going to happen that you cannot predict. And you're basically saying, yes, we accept that. We can't plan everything. We cannot predict everything. It's also an acknowledgement that things are not going to go the way you want them to. No matter how much work you put into it, there will be issues. You will make mistakes. Things will happen, some of them in your control, some of them out of your control, and you will have to deal with them. And really, all that project risk and issue management is a set of techniques to deal with this reality, that the world is uncertain, stuff's going to go wrong, and you're going to have to deal with it. And that's all it really is. But it's important because this is inevitable. Every project is going to have risks, and every project will encounter issues. You cannot avoid it. No matter how good your team is, no matter how good your planning is, no matter how good your tool sets are, no matter how good a vendor you might hire to help you, you're going to have risks, and you're going to encounter issues. You cannot avoid them, but you can manage them. And what we've seen is that the ability to manage risks and issues is one of the most important predictors of project success or failure. And all the other things you look at around good governance and schedule management and software engineering discipline and testing and all those things, they're all important. But if you can't manage risks and issues, your project is probably going to have significant issues and may well fail. The thing that I find very interesting about this topic, if you think about all of the other disciplines you have, especially if you're on a technology project, some kind of system implementation project, you have software engineering, business process re-engineering, hardware engineering, network architecture. All of those things are quite technically complex. Even something like schedule management, like building an MS project schedule for a big project, it's a pretty hard task. It's actually fairly complicated. You need people with a specific set of experience to do it and the specialized tools you need. Risk and issue management really isn't like that. It's actually just the mechanics, and we'll go through it in a few minutes. It's really easy. There's almost nothing to it from a process perspective. You don't need much in tools. You don't need much in training. The steps themselves are very, very easy to follow. And yet, it is almost the hardest thing for projects to get right. And I find it very interesting that one of the most important things for projects to do, that projects almost never can do very effectively, is one of the simplest things. And it's all cultural and organizational. I think that's what we're going to spend some time talking about later on, that the barriers to effective risk and issue management are not because it's technically difficult, it's because it's hard for organizations to face up to the fact that they don't know everything, or to admit that they made mistakes, or to sit in a room with a group of people and have a conversation about an uncomfortable topic that nobody wants to talk about. That's why this is hard, not because it's complicated. And that's, I think, what we're going to spend some time later on talking about. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No.
Okay. Any sort of questions or comments about that before we get into the basics? Okay. So let's talk about the basics of risk and issue management. And again, I'm going to walk through this relatively quickly because it's not particularly complicated. Any of you who had any kind of prior experience, there's nothing going to be new here. But it is, I think, important just to cover those basics. So first of all, what is a risk? A risk is an uncertain event that you do not know it's going to happen, but you think it might, and it's got a consequence to it. If this event occurs, it has some measurable impact on your project. Now, a key point that people often forget, when people talk about risk, they always think about, okay, it's a bad thing. But technically, it's not. It could be a good thing. You can have positive risks and negative risks. It's relatively rare to actually see anybody talking about positive risks. If you look at a risk list on a project, it's rare you'll ever find one that's got something good on it that could happen, but it does happen sometimes. But it's something to, to think about. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the basic concept is something may happen. You do not know for certain that it might, but if it does, it's got an impact. And you want to measure that and you want to address it. I've made this point before, but every project should view risk identification as a really critical process. And it's not something that just happens once. It has to happen regularly, on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, but spending time formally sitting down thinking about what are those things that could happen that might have an impact to us, and how do we deal with that? And really, that's all risk management is. Risks can come from internally to your organization. Maybe there's a risk that these individuals are going to be over-allocated and they can't support all the tasks they need. Or it could be external. The risk that there's going to be some legislation passed and that's going to impact you significantly. They can be predictable and unpredictable. A point I want to make and talk a little bit about is this concept that risks are your friends. They are good things. People often try and shy away from risks or talking about risks as they feel it's almost like an admission of weakness or an admission that there may be problems. But it's a great tool for a project. It's a great way to sit down and have a reasonably structured conversation with your colleagues about the things that are uncertain in the future. It's also a pretty good window into understanding how your organization thinks about uncertainty. If you try and engage in a conversation about risk with the people on your project team or the people in your organization, how do they respond to that? Is that something they're eager to have that conversation about? Is it something that they don't feel comfortable doing? Is it something that they're saying, well, I don't have time for that. I've got real work to do. I don't have time to sit down and talk about this theoretical business. I've got issues I've got to deal with. So it's a way to start getting that sort of a barometer of where your organization is. So the question was about risks are often somewhat subjective, and different people have different opinions about whether things even are a risk or not. So it's a good comment. I think part of the way to address that, and we're going to, in just a second, we're going to unpack sort of the definition a little bit and what are the different elements of a risk. If you can try and get each of those elements to be as tangible as possible, they may disagree on an issue of fact about, is this something that's probable to occur or very improbable, or maybe you disagree about the potential impact. But at least if you can get into a conversation about that, you're having a conversation about the facts as much as you can define them. We're also going to talk in just a second about the concept of quantifying impacts and what can be done to make that more relevant, especially to leadership.
Well, money is always the driving factor behind all of these projects.
So you're a great straight person. Let's move to the next slide.
Right?
So let's talk about the process. Again, this is a very simple process, pretty straightforward. But this is the basic process around managing risks. First item, plan your risk management. So all that really means is define a process. What is your process for managing risks on your project? Write it down, communicate it to all of the parties, and then actually use it. I don't know how many times I've seen projects that have a pretty well-documented risk management plan, but if you actually look at what they're doing day to day, it bears no relationship to the plan. Maybe there were 3 risk meetings and then people just sort of forgot about doing it. That's a relatively common occurrence. Obviously, it has to be used to be effective. Key activity, really the initial activity and actual managing risks, is identifying risks. So this is a formal meeting where you will sit down and you will just have a conversation. It can be a brainstorming session. It can be looking at a set of categories, and we'll talk about categories in a minute. But what are the different kinds of risks that might occur to the project? What things that are uncertain in the future, and they may be business-related issues, there may be funding, it may be resources, it may be technology, it may be third parties that you are dependent on, it may be a contract, potential issues with your vendor, all of those different types of things. What are the things that could happen that might have an impact on your project? And just engage in a discussion with a group of people who represent your project. Do it once to get an initial sense of what might be out there, and then do it repetitively on a common basis, once a week, once a month, whatever it might be. Once you've identified your initial set of risks, then you get to this question of, okay, analyzing them. And what we mean by that usually is, how likely is this thing to occur in terms of the probability of occurrence? And there's different ways to define that, we'll mention. And then, what is the impact associated with this risk? On the chart here, we're showing sort of two different types of potential analysis. We're calling qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. The reason for that quantitative piece is, if you can ever put a dollar figure on something, that's probably a good thing. Money attracts people's attention. So if you can quantify a risk that if this thing happens to us, it could cost us this amount of money, that's a great way to get into a conversation with your leadership and for people to take that risk seriously. Some things are relatively easily quantified. If this thing happens, it's going to delay the schedule by 3 months because of contract implications and additional resources. It's going to cost us $5 million. That kind of thing, relatively easy. There are lots of other things that are much harder to quantify and maybe impossible really to put any kind of dollar figure on, but nevertheless you want to try and make the impact as tangible as possible. It may be a customer service impact, it may be a stakeholder acceptance impact. If such and such a thing happens, our key stakeholder group is going to be much less open to this solution. They may resist us, they may not want to engage with us. It's harder to quantify, but still quite significant. One of the things we've talked about is trying to gauge what your leadership is most concerned about. What is it that worries them about risks? Maybe it's money, but maybe it's not. Jamie, I think you were making a comment before about schedules.
Right. Key is when you're managing risk and you're managing then the people that are decision makers associated with that is being intuitive enough to understand what their drivers are. And it's not the same for everybody, but that's a key trait to have as a risk manager.
Yeah. Another perspective, I work for Grant Thornton. We're a public accounting firm. You will not find a more conservative type of organization in the private sector than a public accounting firm. Big thing for us, yes, we care about money, yes, we care about time. Reputational risk is the big issue for my organization. There is nothing that will get my leadership's attention more than the risk that we might end up on the front page of a newspaper. That gets everybody very excited. So, if you want to get people's attention and make a risk tangible to them, you need to express it in terms that are relevant to your leadership. And thinking about it the other way, if you know what your leadership really values and which kind of risks they're most concerned about, well, those are probably the kind of risks to spend time thinking about. So you making sure you're covering their bases so that if there are risks in that area, you've done your due diligence to make sure you've identified them and can bring them to your leadership to help mitigate them.
We are, as a public sector organization, also risk adverse when, public exposure, basically the proverbial avoid the insert your name here in a headline somewhere. So the problem that drives, you'll find with risk management, is a propensity in the state to view creating a risk list as being counter to that, counterproductive, that it's exposing you to potentially this project will fail. One of the things Graham said yesterday is, and I agree with this, is if you go into a project, one of the first things you should do to assess is look at the risk list. If they only have 2 to 3 items on their risk list and it's a large project, it's not probably a well-run project. That's not a realistic view of any large enterprise project. And so one of the things that we need to learn how to do in this state is be more forthright with that and actually document these things and do really good analytical work to prepare for if these things actually turn into issues, how do we basically then manage those? So.
Does anybody have any questions or comments about that? So the comment was about
There's a lot of risk.
to do this effectively, you need to be a good influencer and have very good communication skills. And this is something that we've talked about. Like what are the qualifications to be a good risk manager on a project? You need to have very strong analytical skills, because it is an analytical task. It's thinking about potential topics that might come up, trying to quantify probability, impact, planning mitigations, tracking those, making sure people are following up on that. So there's an analytical and management side to it. You need to be able to facilitate a group and hold a room. You're going to have a group of people in the room, probably a bunch of opinionated people, and you've got to get those people to work as a team and come to agreement on probably fairly contentious things that they may well disagree about. So you've got to be able to be a good facilitator. And then, the point that was just brought up, you've got to be a very good communicator, especially to leadership. Part of your challenge is convincing leadership that this is something that they have to be worried about, and it's also trying to convince them that this is the right path, or this is a mitigation that's appropriate, and it's worth investing resources to mitigate this risk.
One of the things, and I'm not slighting IT because I've been in IT for over 30 years, but traditionally I believe that this is probably more suited for a non-IT, more of an individual senior level person from program. Not only do you need all the skills that Graham just said, but you also need someone who basically has that reputation in the community that they're basically interfacing with, where they can be able to do that. I mean, you're going to be sitting in a room with a lot of alpha personalities that are not used to people telling them no, or let this person talk, or your opinion, may not matter. You know what I mean? And so managing that interaction and the dynamics, it's not something in IT that we're traditionally taught how to do, and it's something that people may develop over a long period of time, but program may actually be a better source of individuals for this specific type of role. And it is also, too, for the size of a project, it is a full-time role, and this is one of those key positions like a schedule manager. And as Graham said, that it's not something that you just do and you put it on the shelf and it's evidence that you show, like Caltech or somebody like that. Look, we have a risk management plan. We check that off the list. It's something that you have to do real time. It's air traffic controller type of job, where you're constantly watching, what's going on in the project and documenting and so on. So and doing that analysis and then communicating that effectively to people, so these risks don't actually come to light and become issues.
Okay. So you've got a list of risks. You've done some initial analysis about what you think the impact might be if that happened. How probable is it that this thing's going to happen? So the question is then, okay, what do we do about it? And so that's this plan risk response step, to identify an action or a set of actions that you will take for each one of those risks. And the next slide, we're going to talk about sort of options, about what kind of responses you can pick from. But the key thing here is you have a plan, you have an assignment of somebody who is accountable for that plan, and you have some dates associated with it. So it's not just a matter of everybody saying, yeah, this is sort of a risk, we get it, and then you sort of agree and then you walk out of the room. You need somebody to be the person who is responsible for tracking that and dealing with it over time. And then you get into the controlling phase. So this is really where you are looking at whatever plan you had to respond to that risk, and you are monitoring that on a regular basis, on a weekly or a monthly basis, to see, well, did you actually take the mitigation actions or whatever response you were planning on that risk? Are those actions actually being taken? Is the plan that you put in place still relevant? Circumstances may well have changed, and the actions that you plan to take to address that risk may no longer be the right actions. So you've got to re-review that. And the third part, well, maybe it's no longer a risk. Maybe circumstances have changed, and it's not something you need to worry about anymore. You can retire it. Or maybe circumstances have changed, and it's not a risk anymore. It's an issue. It happened. Okay, now we can move into a different set of actions. But the key is, don't lose sight of it, be actively monitoring it, and the role of the risk manager is to make sure that they're holding people accountable, that if they took an action, that they are actually following up and doing that. So that's really sort of the management side of this, is, it's a role in holding people accountable for their responsibilities as well, which is why this person needs to have some level of seniority. Giving this kind of role to a very junior person on the team puts them in a very difficult position because they may have to go and chase down some relatively senior people on the project and basically hold them to account. And that's hard for somebody who's relatively junior to do. So any questions on that basic process? Pretty simple.